Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with the Chapter 7 lecture. I'm hoping that the audio recording actually works because I already recorded this lecture and I didn't get any audio from it. So this is my second attempt. Sorry if the volume is a little low or it just doesn't sound very good. I'm just having to place the microphone really close to my mouth in order to get a decent volume level. And of course that picks up every little sound I make, so I apologize if the audio is not the best quality. But here we go with Chapter 7. We're going to be covering photosynthesis, which is using light to make food. Okay, so let's get started with the basics of photosynthesis. You probably know that plants use this process. It's also used by algae and some bacteria. And the overall process transforms light energy into chemical energy and uses carbon dioxide and water as the starting materials. The chemical energy produced via photosynthesis is stored in the bonds of sugar molecules. And organisms that use photosynthesis are known as photosynthetic autotrophs. Remember that auto means self, trophs refers to feeding or trophic levels, so this literally means self-feeders. That means they can make their own food, and they form the basis for most ecosystems. Here are a few examples of photosynthetic autotrophs. We have all of our familiar land plants like grasses, other flowering plants, trees, etc. Those are all photosynthesis producers there. We have photosynthetic protists, which are aquatic, such as kelp. And we also have some bacterial species that are also able to produce their own food. This is a micrograph of cyanobacteria. Okay, so where exactly does photosynthesis occur? It occurs somewhere within plants, but more specifically, it occurs in organelles within the cells of plants. So chloroplasts are the site of photosynthesis, and they're found mostly in the interior cells of leaves. Inside chloroplasts are interconnected membranous sacs called thylakoids, which are suspended in a thick fluid called stroma. Thylakoids in turn are concentrated in stacks called grana. Singular will be granum. Oops. The green color of chloroplasts is from chlorophyll, which is a light-absorbing pigment that plays a central role in converting solar energy to chemical energy. And stomata are tiny pores in leaves where carbon dioxide enters and oxygen exits. So you can think of stomata as the lungs within leaves. This is just where gas exchange occurs. Okay, so what might this look like? Here we have a leaf. If we were to take a cross-section of that leaf and examine it under a high-powered microscope, this is a depiction of what that would look like. We have photosynthetic cells lining the upper and lower surface of the leaf. And then on the surface of that leaf we have the stomata, which are the sites of gas exchange, where carbon dioxide enters and oxygen exits. And this vein here would be part of the vascular system of the plant, which is a conduit for water as well as minerals and sugars. If we were to look at just one of these photosynthetic cells, this is an actual micrograph here, we would see many chloroplasts, which are these specialized organelles that produce chemical energy from light energy. And if we were to look inside a single chloroplast, this is a depiction of what that might look like. We have these stacks of thylakoids here. The spaces between them are the thylakoid space. A stack of thylakoids is known as a granum, and the stroma would be the thick fluid that surrounds the thylakoids. Just like a mitochondrion has an inner and outer membrane, a chloroplast also has an inner and outer membrane. So it's going to be important to know this when we get into more details of how the Calvin cycle works as far as the hydrogen ion concentration gradient there. Okay, in the overall equation for photosynthesis, notice that the reactants here are the waste products of cellular respiration. So the starting materials, the carbon dioxide and water, if we look at the cellular respiration equation, are the products of that equation. Carbon dioxide and water, carbon dioxide and water. This series of arrows just means that photosynthetic reactions are occurring, and the end products are glucose and oxygen gas, which again, if we go back to the cellular respiration equation, we see that the reactants here, glucose and oxygen, are the same as the products here. So these are very complementary cycles. In photosynthesis, sunlight is what ultimately provides the energy. Electrons are boosted uphill and added to carbon dioxide, which reduces it, and sugar is produced. Also during photosynthesis, water is split into hydrogen and oxygen. Hydrogen is transferred along with electrons and added to carbon dioxide to produce sugar, and oxygen escapes through stomata into the atmosphere. Just as cellular respiration occurs in a series of steps, so photosynthesis does as well. There are what are known as the light reactions, which convert solar energy to chemical energy. And then there's the Calvin cycle, which uses the products of the light reactions to make sugar from carbon dioxide. So notice that energy is not actually usable energy is not actually being produced here in the light reactions, but the products of the light reactions go into the Calvin cycle, and that is how the usable energy is made. The initial incorporation of carbon from the atmosphere into organic compounds is called carbon fixation. You may have heard of nitrogen fixation if your family is a farming family and use cover crops or certain crops that help with nitrogen fixation. When you see an element followed by fixation, that means that that element is being incorporated into living tissue, so it's more usable for living things. So this process in plants is known as carbon fixation, and it's very important for lowering the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Now, a bad thing about human activity on the planet is we tend to use a lot of raw materials to build our infrastructure and houses. So deforestation ultimately reduces the ability of the biosphere to absorb carbon by reducing the amount of photosynthetic plant life. And to make matters a little bit worse is we usually are using fossil fuels and thus emitting more carbon dioxide into the air while we are taking out these trees, which further reduces the ability of the planet to regulate climate. This is a depiction of a chloroplast within a cell in a leaf. We have light energy entering, we have water provided by the plant, of course gathered from the soil, and both of these products are necessary for the light reactions to occur. The products of the light reactions are going to be NADPH and ATP, and output is going to be oxygen. So this is where oxygen is produced by the plant and helps make the atmosphere breathable. The second step, of course, the Calvin cycle, uses the products from the light reactions, as well as CO2 from the atmosphere, in order to produce sugar, as well as NADP plus and ADP, which are going to be necessary for running the light reactions. Chloroplasts can be thought of as chemical factories which are powered by the sun, and they ultimately convert sunlight into chemical energy. Sunlight is a type of energy called radiation, or electromagnetic energy, and the distance between the crests of two adjacent waves is known as wavelength. The full range of radiation is called the electromagnetic spectrum. So here we have the electromagnetic spectrum. Visible light is within this portion between UV and infrared radiation. And visible light includes wavelengths of 380 to 750 nanometers. And again, the wavelength is just the measurement between one crest of a wave of light and the next crest. So for example, a wavelength for this light orange color of visible light is going to be about 580 nanometers. Why do you suppose that we see most plants as green? I'll give you a little bit of time to look at this diagram and think about that for a moment. We see most plants as green because the sun gives off a huge spectrum of light, and the visible light, of course, ranges from red all the way to violet here. The chloroplasts within a leaf cell are better at using light in the red through orange and blue through violet wavelengths rather than green. So they absorb light of those wavelengths and they transmit light of the green wavelength, and that is why we see plants as green, because that wavelength of light is what is reflected back out at us. This is just a closer up diagram of that. Again, these wavelengths of light that do not include green are more useful for the photosynthetic reactions. So they are absorbed within chloroplasts, and the green light, which is not as useful for photosynthesis, is transmitted and reflected. Okay, so this is just a little overview of an experiment that was used to help identify the colors of light that were responsible for driving photosynthesis. So as the observation in this scientific experiment, in 1883, German biologist Theodor Engelmann saw that certain bacteria tend to cluster in areas with higher oxygen concentrations. So he wondered whether or not this information could determine which wavelengths of light work best for photosynthesis. Why were those bacteria clustering in areas of high oxygen concentration? And his hypothesis was that the bacteria were actually seeking out the oxygen, so they would end up congregating near regions of algae that were performing the most photosynthesis. Remember that oxygen is a byproduct of photosynthesis. So if a particular region of algae was producing a lot of oxygen, then you could also conclude that that area was responsible for photosynthesizing. In his experiment, Engelmann laid a string of freshwater algal cells in a drop of water on a microscope slide. He then added oxygen-sensitive bacteria to the drop, and he used a prism to create a spectrum of light shining on the slide. I'm going to pause here and pick up with this experiment in the next segment.